Great. I think we're at least at a quorum and more people will be coming on, but welcome everybody to the sixth and final session of the Just Zero virtual conference. We have been, over the last few days, trying to track the role of investors in the broader structural transformation that a movement to a low carbon economy entails, and especially thinking about the role of workers and communities in that transition and what investors can do. What is investors' role amongst all the other stakeholders who are engaged? Investors can't do it themselves, but they can play a part. We've had sessions on leadership and how to define what investors can do and do well. We've had a session on shareholder engagement and where investors can engage corporations that they own or other ways they can use their investments to raise their voice. We focused on emerging markets. And the differences between the global north and the global south and the sort of embeddedness in place of just transition. We heard from workers and communities and talked about how their voices can be present and direct what a just transition looks like. Today, there was a session that really focused on one place, the UK, and a Just Transition Alliance, which has made great progress in thinking through what a strategic action for investors would look like. And in this session, the last session, we're going to try to make sense of it all. And I think more importantly, think about what we can do going forward to draw from what's happened. A lot has happened, not enough has happened, and it's a base on which to build. To do that, we're joined by Nick Robbins from the Grantham Research Institute for Climate Change and the Environment at LSE, with whom we've been working at the IRI. I should have said who I am. Oops. I'm David Wood. I work at the Initiative for Responsible Investment at Harvard Kennedy School. Hi, everybody. And I've been working with Nick and others. My colleague Vonda Brunsting is on the line. Nick's colleague Sabrina Mueller, Alison Peacock, Tad Thorburn, our colleague Aaron Shackelford at the IRI, all of whom have done an amazing job putting on this virtual conference with virtual resources. Really just done a great job making it happen. So thanks, everybody, especially Nick. You've shouldered a huge load. But Nick's going to kind of summarize what we've heard and some key points. And then we're going to turn to our colleagues who have joined us. We're grateful that you're all here. We have Alison Tate, who's the Director of Economic and Social Policy at the International Trade Union Confederation. ITUC really inspired our work and I think shaped a lot of the way I personally think about just transition. We have Rachel Kyte, who's Dean at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. John Morrison, the CEO of the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Gildas Poissonnier, Director of Sustainability at Desjardins, and Bettina Reinboth, Director of Human Rights and Social Issues at the Principles for Responsible Investment, along with the ITUC, really the sort of starting collaborators with GRI and the IRI at the Kennedy School for this project. We have asked, first we'll start with Nick, who's going to give that summary, and we've asked our participants to sort of think about what should investors take to COP? Investors who care about the just transition, what can they bring into these broader discussions? And what should policymakers and other stakeholders expect or ask of investors at COP26 and going forward? So that's going to be kind of frame for what we do. We'll try to keep it conversational. There is a Q&A box. Dump your Q&A. You dump your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to answer them. We'll get to them. Whether we successfully answer them will be seen. And we'd love to hear from you. So Nick, why don't you go ahead and take us through what you've heard and what we've heard the past few days.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks to everyone joining this panel and also everybody online. We've had, as you say, we've had 5 sessions. This is the 6th, so a huge amount. I'll just try and sort of pull out about sort of 5 points, if I may, which might sort of help set up the conversation. The first came across very clearly, perhaps not surprisingly, how the just transition is essential to climate success. It's part of being Paris aligned. Sharon Barrow highlighting we need to put people and planet on an equal footing. And I think also highlighting the importance to anticipate the changes ahead. Laura Martin from Spain's Institute for Just Transition was highlighting that. I think a real sense of potential, a potential for us to shape the shift that is happening, to shape the shift so it has positive outcomes. And also very clearly that the just transition is not an addenda, it's not an afterthought. And also it's not something to be used to block the transition. So just transition being essential. The second thing, which again, this is a series of events which we focus on finance, is there is momentum clearly growing in the finance sector. There's dialogue that's been going on with workers, with communities, business and governments. There is engagement, as you mentioned, David, and also engagement as shareholders, but also bondholders. So that is happening, with one investor sort of pressing a number of its holdings to have just transition plans by COP in a week's time. I think 6 out of 7 will do that. We have growing numbers of assessment mechanisms, because I think one of the things people find is obviously, what do we mean by just transition? So assessment mechanisms through Climate Action 100+, through the World Benchmarking Alliance. We have assets to invest in. The UK's Green Sovereign Bond has got provisions to report on social co-benefits. We got guidance in terms of good investor practices. Ceres presented a guide about how you could deliver responsible contracting in clean energy. And we've got the beginnings of sort of just transition being incorporated into international climate finance, which obviously will be so crucial at COP, the so far missed 100 billion target. But how do we think about just transition in terms of climate finance in developing countries, particularly if we're going to need to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels and so on. So that, I think, momentum is happening. Again, I think this is being led by a vanguard of investors and others, but that's positive to see. Third thing, I think, is what does good look like? And again, perhaps no surprises, but I think a richness that came out. We do have the ILO guidelines on the just transition, which came out about the same time as the Paris Agreement from 2015, focusing on protecting rights of work as we move forward on climate action, focusing on the needs of the most vulnerable. Social dialogue emerged as absolutely essential. As Sam Smith from the Just Transition Centre, if we don't have workers at the table, it's not a just transition. In our last session in the UK, Paul Novak from the Trade Union Congress saying, nothing about us without us. But also broader stakeholder engagement and seeing people as active participants in the transition. Place-based action, really thinking about local, regional dimensions is important. This is a whole economy transition, about both the high carbon sectors, which are going to need to transition, also ensuring that the green jobs that are emerging in new sectors are good jobs. And also, I think a number of points being made that this is not just about the energy transition, but the broader transition around nature, land use, and biodiversity as well. So that was an interesting point. Potential gender dimensions as well. As we know, particularly in the energy sector, this has been obviously male dominated for many, many decades and centuries. So there is a potential to make this more gender balanced as we move through the transition. And I think that all of this is going to require clear compliance, monitoring and reporting. But I think a message from all of this in terms of what good looks like, that actually just transition done well secures trust and accelerates transition. So that's, I suppose, the good news. Point 3 is big challenges remain, and we really do need to be honest about this. That most companies are still not serious about net zero, let alone just transition. That we know that change can generate social tensions, and that can be manipulated to breed backlash. We need to be thinking quite broadly and systemically, particularly just thinking beyond sort of particular fossil fuel assets. A good example from India, thinking about the dependence of the rail sector on transportation of coal in particular. We really do need to think about the imperatives and the needs of developing and emerging economies, who in many senses need to transition much faster than the industrialized world, and particularly thinking about existing high levels of unemployment, for example, in South Africa, and the informal working economy. And then that comes to the question of concessional public finance internationally, thinking through how we both meet and exceed the 100 billion, and how some of that is channeled into the social dimension of climate finance. And then I think very powerfully coming through in the session on sort of voice and place is how clearly net zero is already driving corporate restructuring. It's driving not just divestment by investors, but divestment by corporates. And often, as particularly in the fossil fuel sectors, this divestment can lead to buyers taking on assets and leading to a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards. And I think there are some very powerful examples of that from workers in the US about that. So I think that's the rawness of potentially, as one participant said about us, we could have a sort of dystopian energy transition. So one of the things, again, as a final point, is the sort of be honest piece is, maybe we shouldn't also be falling for the sort of generally accepted view that doing social is really too hard. And as one participant said, if you can figure out scope 3 emissions, you can figure out labor rights. Now, obviously, it's tougher and so on, but I think there's a sort of not invented here thing for investors, that actually perhaps it's all too hard and it's all too qualitative and so on. So I'm sure many of the participants, the panelists, will have something to say for that. And then the final point is where we are now and ahead of COP26. COP26 really being the time to put just transition at the heart. As one of the people in the previous sessions, just transition is not the sideshow, but the main show, Giant Sinha from India saying that. Clearly, that means policy, designing climate action so that just transition, poverty eradication is part of that, fossil fuel subsidies, carbon pricing, and so on. Public finance, big role for public finance domestically and internationally. And then the role of investors and private finance. I think really coming through that every single corporate net zero plan, every single investor transition plan should have just transition as part of that. Clearly improving the dialogue that goes on between workers and business and also with investors. And then I think an appeal for radical collaboration, that this is a team sport, just transition a team sport, and really the role of investors working with others to deliver this. So, David, that's what I managed to pull out, and I'm sure this session will add a lot more to
that. You pulled out a ton, and it gives me the sense that there is at least some movement. But could you just say a word about, when we started our project together, and in your work in the UK, I think we've gone from investors saying, just transition, what's that? To, wow, that seems really important, but it seems intractable. What do you think of the, or it's difficult to sort of make part of our work in the way that those scope 3 emissions might be. What do you make of the trajectory of just transition as an investment topic?
Well, I think it's an interesting curve, isn't it? I mean, I think in a sense, when we started in early 2018, actually with Bettina's team at the PRI, the ITUC, and so on, just transition was unheard of largely in the investor community, and I think was seen as rather scary as a concept. But I think as people saw it and recognized how it fitted within the broader parameters of ESG and the sort of broader necessity for it, I think people picked up. There was that statement which PRI members signed with, I think, about $10 trillion in 2018. And I think it's largely through the shareholder engagement mechanism. And I think we'll see that going forward. And I'm sure Bettina wants to say more about that. But through initiatives such as the Climate Action 100 Plus, it's going to become much more mainstream. So we're going to have the largest carbon polluters on the planet being required to respond on this. And I think that will hopefully develop a broader base of understanding. So I think we're at that pivot point, I think, from sort of recognition to early stage action to broadening. The big area, I think, is actually the sort of deployment of capital, particularly in sort of localities and regions and so on. I think the sort of the shareholder engagement part, I think I can see that going well in the future, but actually how we need to think about capital allocation differently according to just transition, that's perhaps we haven't made as much progress on.
Yeah, thanks. And I'd add to that, I think that the policy regimes for finance around just transition, is a place we need to think more about too, that really hasn't gotten the attention that it will get. That's great. Tons to work with, but we have lots more to do. Alison, given what we've been talking about, given all your work on just transition and this little piece of it with engaging with investors, what do you think investors should do to take into the COP, and what do you think the COP should ask of them?
Well, hi, everyone. Investors and all of us have to raise the visibility of demands for action, for collaboration, and for ambition. The IPCC, the UN Secretary General, and workers on the front lines of climate impact are all calling Code Red. This is the age of just transition. COP26 must deliver action and hope. The climate action, decarbonisation, and just transition plans are not aspirational and somewhere out there in 2030 or even 2025, it's now. So while 49 countries refer to just transition in their NDCs, nearly 9 out of 10 are denying working people and communities a say in their own future by not using social dialogue. That's from our assessment of the NDCs currently submitted. So less than a quarter of governments commit to just transition in their NDCs. This fails. This fails to give working people and communities hope, and it fails to build trust. So the point that Nick makes about the 100 billion a year, world leaders and the UN need to deliver in the first days of the COP a real commitment around finance for loss and damage, the famous 100 billion a year, that's been promised over years and is still not delivered. So international commitments to financing are a critical matter of trust. So then we move to the role of investors and financial actors. So we have governments, we have multilateral organizations, international financial institutions. How to finance a just transition, is this part of the conversation? And that we need, back to 2015, when I think about the argument for advocating for just transition to be included in the Paris Agreement, having had the ILO guidelines already agreed, Nick referred to, as the international framework for that, as guidance. What we now see is people saying, oh, inequity, oh, inequality, oh, the social consequences. That's a strong foundation, but that's not just transition. Just transition is not everything. What we're talking about is actually having an employment plan alongside a carbon emissions reduction plan. So for every government at every level, and that's what it's being committed to in Glasgow at the NDC level, but it's actually regional governments and provincial governments and municipalities and city governments. And it's actually how are the financing arrangements being planned? Who's being taken into consideration? So how do we move investors, the role of investors and other financial actors, to look at how we actually pay for that transition? We've got grants, loans, bailouts, recovery funds, public finance, project finance, and access to credit. I'm reminded of what the speaker from SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association from India, said yesterday: access to local credit for people themselves to be able to make the transition and ensure that their own carbon footprints are reduced. So the question about financing a just transition is not about a lack of capital. The last session just addressed that. And I would also add that UNCTAD's published statistics this week. Global direct foreign investment flows in the first half of 2021 reached an estimated 852 billion. We're talking 100 billion a year. It's pocket money. That we do not have a global alignment that that's possible to actually be serious and drive not only what's needed in terms of loss and damage, but actually trust building for the poorest countries. So of that 852 billion from rock bottom 2020 levels, that's double into high income countries. It's 30% increase in middle income countries. And sadly, it's a further 9% decline into low income countries. So what we are talking about is global mobilization and allocation of assets, the famous billions. So there's much more to say, David, but we are way past the decision about are we investing in green or brown economies? No, we are investing in, if investors are serious and taking their responsibilities seriously, then it's all about directing finance, whichever vehicles they're using, into employment-rich recovery that is needed to address inequality, to address unemployment, and to ensure that we have a sustainable economy globally.
Great. Yes, I mean, I agree entirely, both with the scale and with the way you placed investors in this discussion. One thing, just briefly, since you're at the ITUC and I came to know you through the Committee on Workers' Capital, what's the role of workers and workers' capital in this discussion about what investors can do?
Workers' capital is what we refer to as all of our deferred wages, our pension funds, and where they're invested. So actually having the right settings in terms of public policy is really essential. And many pension funds are arguing not only for the understanding of labor rights and ESG criteria to take social seriously, not as an afterthought, but as a central guiding principle on how investment allocations are made, then what we're saying is that the social dialogue mechanisms that are a part of delivering a just transition measure are actually also part of the decision-making about investor strategies and investor policies. So to anticipate and plan for and deliver a just transition that is real, it is about aligning all the various different investment vehicles we have. And so pension fund allocation is essential to that. But I would add, David, that just transition is essential to involve the actors in the real economy. That includes the asset owners, not only the asset managers.
Yeah.
So the engagement with companies about what their plans are, and are they real, and are they accountable, and are they timely, is really important to securing public consent on both public spending and the way in which global resources are genuinely being allocated.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Rachel, I'd love to hear both your reflections on what Alison said, but also just the general question of where do investors sit in these discussions, and especially in kind of this world of development finance and global capital flows. What do we need to ask of investors?
Well, I think just reflecting on, first of all, I think congratulations to everybody who's played a role in getting this concept sort of as far as it is into the bloodstream of our economic discussions and our financial discussions. We've still got a way to go, but I think we have to pat ourselves on the back when we get to these kind of milestones. I think we're at a very dangerous point in that. As others have said, we don't really have the politics that the science needs, and we really, if this were an emergency and you were landing on the planet from Mars, right, you would be hard pressed to understand why we weren't galvanized into an emergency response, which we're capable of, because look at what we did at the G20 in 2009, right? We were capable of, finding $100 trillion in 2 weeks, bluntly speaking. So I think that investors have done, I think, a lot in terms of internalizing the risk. I think we've got ways to go to fully embrace the opportunity. And that's because, people do risk well, right? That's how the whole system is set up to operate. The opportunity side of it is that is a little more difficult. And that's where you really need the public policy investor, public policy, private finance discussion to go. And that requires real vision in our leaders, both on the private side and the public side. And we've got a bit of a deficit at the moment. And in the middle of all of that, a community is just like terrified about how they're supposed to get through all of this. And of course, we've made it really difficult for ourselves, because we're now going to start having a loss and damage conversation off the back of an insipid approach to the 100 billion, right? So if that's a proof of the pudding, it's not worth eating. And we're going to try to now finance adaptation and loss and damage off the back of a sort of risk-based approach, which means that we'll never get there. And we're going to do it just as developed countries are starting to see the budget line items for the costs accruing to their own economies, right? Hurricane Ida, 65 billion. Florida, over 100 billion every year, are just going up and going up and going up. So we're now going to have to solve all of this when the pain is already beginning to be felt. So, but I think there are more intrinsic problems, which is, the divestment movement announced right yesterday or today. I lost track. I took a day off, and now I can't work out which press release I saw when. And I think we've gone from 14 trillion to 40 trillion, right? And which is an extraordinary movement, right? However, there is also the beginning of a litmus test not the beginning. There's a litmus test in investing, right? So it's okay to invest in green, right? Super green, clean. but we're going to have to invest in the brown that's going to get green, right? And that means brown companies that are committed to green. But because we have no agreement on guardrails around integrity yet, and because there is a litmus test, and because there's a very successful divestment movement going on out there, and because we know we need to stop exploring and get out of fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and because we don't have international governance around the decommissioning funds that will have to be put in place so that countries can make the transition, in the absence of the things that the building blocks we really need, we've now got this sort of like, are you green enough? And if not, I'm not going to invest in you. But we need to invest in the companies and the assets that are brown today, but will become green, and because it's a transition. And so, plus you can't make money in the super green, clean, squeaky end of the spectrum, right? The money's going to be made in those that go. So who are going to be the brave investors who sort of step out, put their heads above the parapet and go for the brown? And because I think that's where we'll get the real speed then. But if we wanted to go really fast, we would have effective carbon prices. We would have a conversation going on between the trade regime and economic governance. We would have completely repurposed multilateral development banks and Bretton Woods institutions, because it's not about whether or not the bank ever invests ever again in any upstream oil and gas. It's about why we're not building the just transition into the social safety nets packages, and why, if you're a poor woman getting relief from your central government because of a bank or IMF program, that doesn't include clean fuel for cooking and access to clean water and access to clean electricity. So we haven't gone all the way there yet. So I can wake up one morning and be deeply optimistic, because people like Nick will lead us through the next few years. But there are moments when I wonder how we muster the sort of reset of the institutions that we would normally depend upon in a moment like this. We don't have them. They're fraying at the edges. We need new rules for the game. And those are emerging, but they're emerging from hybrid governance. They're emerging from the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, or from, and that's great. But it's a high risk, high reward moment. I'll leave it like that.
Seems like we woke up the same way this morning. Just briefly, I just want to pull out one piece. I think the context setting you did generally is right. And surely if this is a crisis, there is no response to a crisis that meets the magnitude of the challenge. But if one of the things to do is to get a public policy regime around private finance, what's the mechanism to get there, or what would be the step towards a useful mechanism to get there that we could get to quickly or reasonably quickly?
The simple answer, right, is, well, and of course it would only be one, it would be the beginning of a sequence of actions. But if we had more effective pricing of carbon in more jurisdictions, and by effective I mean like not the kind of internal prices we see in many companies, but if we really started to price it properly, you would start to see investment flow into even a brown company that thought it could move into green hydrogen, and you would generate, and you would start to see, and if we started to talk about taxes properly, then you could start to generate revenue into the social safety net packages that you need. Secondly, I think we have to reset how developing countries get access to capital markets. And I think we're really going to have to test the Paris Agreement, because if it is bottom up, countries come with plans, and we have to fund those plans. Even if we don't like everything about that plan, that's called democracy, that's called international governance. And I don't think we can sit and, oh, that's your NDC, but we don't like that bit, we only like that bit. We don't have plausibility as the developed world if that's still the way it's going to go. And then I think we call a meeting, we'll do it, down the river near your house, and we have a new Bretton Woods, we thrash it out, and we have the trade regime, we have economic governance there, but it's not going to be the same people. It's not going to be the sort of carbon country club. It's going to have to be a different group of people, but we have to start visioning it and building it.
Yeah, no, we should do that. And I think democratic accountability is part of the just transition in my sort of vision of it. I think that's a really important point. John, what do you make of the moment?
I probably got out the same side of the bed as everyone else.
But not the same bed. We don't want people talking.
No, Rachel, no, let's not start that. I want to channel, some of the remarks that I've heard over the past 3 days. Nick and colleagues, congratulations on an excellent conference. Brian Motherway on the first day remind us to, some excellent principles coming out of his commission. And I love the last principle about seeing people as active agents, putting human agency at the center of this. Sharon, of course, reminded us of the importance of having workers and worker rights at the center. From the perspective of my organization, it becomes less clear. Everyone talks about communities. No one has been very clear about what that means. And of course, there's a gender dimension, a children dimension, a human rights defender dimension, an indigenous peoples dimension, etc. So I do think we need to think about human rights in the broader sense, whilst keeping workers and jobs at the center of the discussion. John Gummer encouraged us to take the wider view, and Saka on the panel before as well invoked Adam Smith. So I'm going to also, Nick, pick up in my brief words now, pick up your challenge about this issue of the deployment of capital, if you like, this wider challenge in which investors sit. And maybe just give some examples around the energy transition, accepting that there are other transitions. And this, I would say all this because this is what we're doing at COP26, of course, ourselves. Trying to bring together the finance community with the demand side and the supply side to talk about social standards, human rights in the middle of that, hopefully. Now, the demand side, of course, consumers, but then we have cities, we have governments, corporates. The thing about emails is true. I mean, corporates, particularly in the IT sector, have huge carbon footprints. And what you see is that the efforts being taken there, such as the climate pledge that a lot of these companies, particularly American companies, the big corporate users have taken, are social free zones, right? These are purely environmental commitments with no social content, let alone just transition. So there's a real need to bring those guys into the room. And when you bring them into the room, given some of them are acquiring their own wind farms, right? You bring leverage into the room at the same time. Then you bring them with the supply side. And supply is, of course, the energy companies, but it's also the people that dig the commodities out of the ground, the copper, the lithium, the nickel, the zinc, the rare earth. If you've gone deep in any of these commodities and looked at any of the predictions about how much we're going to need, then you begin to see why thinking about indigenous peoples and other communities is so important, because where is all this stuff going to come from? One statistic is that by 2050, we'll need more copper than has ever been dug out of the ground in history. It's dug out from all over the world, but 51% of it travels through China for smelting. So you've got a securitization issue at the very time that people are talking about moving from a mass balance approach to commodities to a fully traceable or more traceable approach. And that will create bifurcation in supply chains, the securitization of supply, etc. All of this going on. This needs to be part of the same conversation. And then finally, of course, the other corner is the finance community itself. And the question about metrics to the previous panel, and Nick, you've cited the World Benchmarking Alliance a lot, and next week they'll bring forward their metrics on the just transition. And that's a good thing, as many people have said. Others have been working on private banks, as you have, Nick. I know Clifford Chance has been doing that. We have an event with them on the 9th of December for Human Rights Day. The NDBs, EBRD will be sharing their work next week at COP26 as well. But if you took a look at other financial actors, remember they sit between the supply and the demand side of this. They have leverage, they have the potential for alignment. Export credit agencies, which is one piece I know quite well, are nowhere on this at all. Private equity companies, I've yet to see much going on there. If you look at TCFD, that's been mentioned a few times over the past few days, there's no social risk component to TCFD at all. So what do we do with that? Do we reinvent everything in a bigger way, or are we tacking stuff on? And of course, the EU taxonomy has some level of human rights involved, but these are just UNGP safeguards. This is not, it's avoiding the bigger question around human rights impacts, as well as a full due diligence approach. So I don't care if we call this other piece human rights and the energy transition and sit it alongside just transition. Let's not spend ages arguing about terminology, but we need to be having the same conversations together to build the leverage we need. So that's my hope going into next week. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what you just said resonates with what we've heard, over the course, I think, of in every panel about how the S needs to be central in the ESG, and just transition can't be an addenda. For instrumental reasons, we won't have a transition if it's not just, and for ethical reasons, why would you do it unjustly? In your specific case, like, how has that manifested itself, or where do you see investors pushing human rights out of the discussion? How do you bring them in?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different answers. So if you're thinking about investors in the wider sense of financial players, then they each have their different excuses. I mean, as Rachel can talk about better than I do, many of them look to the old Bretton Woods, the IFC performance standards of 2011, right, as their global benchmark. That takes you some of the way, but there's a hell of a long way, much further you need to go in terms of global standards here. So, some are moving, and private banks have more flexibility. It's, somehow ironic that Equator 4 is ahead of the IFC performance standards now. So you've actually got the private sector innovating beyond the World Benchmarking Alliance as well, beyond where governments are at. So Rachel's quote about, do we have the politics the planet needs? Clearly we don't. So maybe building bigger incentives and disincentives around supply demand. And I would encourage all of the investors going to COP and the wider finance community to get engaged in the supply demand conversation with the corporates, with the mayors. I'm very pleased that Sadiq Khan, for example, Mayor of London, will be chairing the C40 as of next week. So mayors, have a big part to play in the demand side of this as well. Yeah, just get everyone involved in this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, Nick sort of called out radical collaboration, and it's a structural conversation. That's difficult to give teeth. Gildas, you have specific engagement with policymakers, but also, with your own institution's finance. How do you see the just transition, becoming a useful part, a central part of COP?
Hi, David. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à toutes et à tous, and thank you to LSE and Grantham Research Institute for inviting me. Well, let me highlight four key messages that I take back from the conference, and maybe that could be brought to COP. Obviously, yes, first one, a just transition must consider current workers and the local communities, which will be most directly impacted by the changes required by the transition. I would say that those communities, in particular the youth and the active workers, should be engaged, listened to, and part of the discussion to define the path to follow for a just transition. The second message I take is that transition obviously will be region specific, with a very diverse situation and transition approaches. But in the end, it will impact everybody one way or another. In Canada, for example, the transition is obviously likely to impact the workers and families in Alberta very differently than it will in Ontario. But both regions will have to adjust by any means. While Alberta will have to adjust its oil and gas sector, Ontario will need to adjust, for example, its car manufacturing industry to respond to electric vehicle demand. And that might mean also reskilling some workers in some form. Third point is that international differences in social safety nets at country level are key components of the challenge associated with the just transition. Why? Because this is a key element for the social acceptance of the transition. So dialogue, communication are key elements of good just transition policies. And to do that, you need to allocate proper time and resources to ensure that just transition actually works. And in that sense, it's better to take a step back so that you can take 2 steps forward. And the first messages I think I would like to bring to COP is that to gather the required momentum necessary to engage communities, policymakers, and workers in such dialogue, I think the signal from investors should be loud and clear that some economic sectors, like coal, are not compatible with the required transition to a net zero economy. And this is the whole purpose, I think, of the Powering Pascal Alliance, from which Desjardins is a member. It's to send a clear signal with investors alongside government and other stakeholders that the sector must transition. Because in the end, the financial sector cannot do it alone. These are such profound changes that we need to have a collective approach and a convergent message between governments, companies, investors, and workers and communities.
Yeah, that's great. And I very much appreciate the way that you and the previous speakers have put the social safety net discussion, as part of the investor discussion, right? Private finance is embedded in these larger capital flows. I'm interested in the Canadian context specifically. Like, it seems that you've had some productive multi-stakeholder engagement that led to something like Powering Pascal. What worked, or how did the investors, companies, workers, and government come together to set up a framework that you thought was actionable, productive?
Yes, definitely. We have seen quite a surge in terms of collaborative initiative over the past few years in Canada. I think first and foremost, because everybody knows that the transition and the just transition is a real challenge in Canada, with a large oil and gas sector, mostly focused in the West, but it has impact across the economy. And we have refineries in Quebec, and you have pipelines across the country. So the need to find a common ground on those topics is really crucial for the overall economy. In that perspective, there has been also quite a recent surge of net zero pledges from the financial sector, and I think it's maybe something that policymakers and stakeholders focused on the just transition should ask from investors, is to follow up on commitments. By that, I mean that one should expect that financial sector in Canada will actively engage investees and client companies to change carbon-intensive business models, but also prepare the workforce of those same companies accordingly. I think to do that, obviously, it's a systemic change that is required, and the system innovation, I think, is only reached by those collaborative approach. And so we have had initiative to develop, for example, a transition taxonomy at bringing together various Canadian investor pension fund, and also those companies from those sectors, to try to define what are the common grounds, what are the requirements in the place of the social component in that energy transition. And currently there is a Sustainable Finance Action Council that is being led by the Canadian government, and bringing also those key financial players across and around the same table to try to define what just transition means in Canada.
Great. I mean, yeah, it's not a new Bretton Woods quite yet, but at least it points towards what that might look like, perhaps. I think there's a lot to learn from what you all have done. Bettina, you're right in the middle of investors who say they want to engage in the just transition. What do they need to do?
It's a good question. I want to actually circle back to what both Gildas and actually Alison outlined at the beginning. And something that we're really asking for at COP is really bold action. So, we call on governments and investors to really raise their ambition and actually take meaningful actions. But actually, when we talk about that commitment and the ambition, to also move on to an implementation. I think we need to really move that into actually what's going to happen, right? And I think, while net zero targets have been by both governments and investors through the Asset Owner Alliance or the Asset Managers Alliance, that's been gaining momentum. I think there's a need to step up both on that kind of level of ambition and commitment, but also on that near-term accountability. So I think in terms of the investor kind of asks for comfort, companies and corporates attending COP, it's really about accelerating that thinking at their level, meaning clear transition, just transition plans that are developed with communities, with workers and consumers, with time-bound targets, that are measurable and actually have a strong accountability mechanism. So that includes kind of how's the governance structure internally looking at this, what's the senior buy-in, like is this something, again, just that's added as an addendum, or is it fully integrated into just transition plans? And like, if it's not, how do you really move that forward? I think there's also a call for obviously governments to really build that explicit commitment to a just transition, again, going back to these kind of collaboration on just transition plans with workers and communities, also ensuring equitable distribution of access to energy and climate solutions at an affordable price. So really looking at the community aspect, which I think John also mentioned a little bit of how, it's beyond just kind of reskilling people, it's really the broader repercussions as well. But I think also there's that hope for investors to actually talk about what investors are doing, right? So we launched this guide back in 2018. There's been quite a lot of activity on how investors are trying to translate that commitment that they've signed under with the investor statement to actually look at it across different action areas. So we mentioned stewardship and obviously climate action 100+. We can see there now with the revised indicators on just transition, trying to flesh that out a little bit more. We're starting to integrate the conversation into those conversations and have those engagement dialogues with the CA 100+ companies, but also examples of how investors are approaching this. Like we've seen in France, Amundi just launched a just transition fund. We've seen successful engagements with different companies, for example, here in the UK with the SSE on their just transition strategy, ways of actually how, we're all new to this and we're all identifying, I think, the problems that we're anticipating, but that we also need to kind of identify before happening. So we don't want to repeat past mistakes, but we need to understand how can we learn on this. And I think, that also leads into the question around collaborations and coalitions. I think the work that Nick and the team at LSE have been doing around the Financing Just Transition Alliance in the UK is great. We're seeing that also come out in France, really using that kind of model across and really bringing more people to the table. Because all of these, are really linked. And that brings me on to the question that's also been raised a little bit around questions around data, the right data. I think Nick mentioned that there was been discussion the last couple of days that we can't stop this conversation because we feel we don't have the right data. There's immense, amounts of data. It's just understanding what's actually meaningful and, using it the right way, essentially. So I think, we are seeing encouraging developments across the investor base, and that's at least signatories for us as well, that the movement has moved from what is this to then actually how do we go about it. But we definitely need to see more on all fronts, whether it's about investor action across, different levers, investment vehicles, and asset allocation, stewardship activities. How do we really actually move that place-based initiatives as well? And how does that place-based conversation feed into big asset owners who are essentially universal owners, where we really bring in that systemic risk come into the conversation, right? And I think we've seen that very much now with COVID as well, looking at especially the social issues being raised, and especially around kind of the questions around decent work and how resilient are some of these business models to these type of shocks. And I mean, climate change is kind of, we're seeing it coming, right? So how can we prepare and actually make sure that no one is actually left behind, and that we're doing it in a proper holistic way. And I think that's my final point in terms of what actually investors really bring in, is to see those agendas holistically. So we see the human rights agenda, and that's why we're also at the PRI elevating that up with our kind of the respect for institutional investors on human rights, alongside with climate. They're very, very interlinked, and they have their own kind of challenges. And also understanding the kind of the social implications throughout. And one way to do that is to really adopt that value chain approach, which I think John also mentioned a little bit earlier. And how do you really go through and see, well, if we're going to move into a different sector, in a decarbonized world, minerals and cobalt and batteries are the new oil. So, okay, what are the social implications of that? We're talking about child labor and the cobalt. We're talking about kind of the life cycle of some of these ideas as well. So I think to your point on, what should policymakers expect from investors? I would say greater push from investors on really leveling the playing field on mandatory environmental, but also human rights due diligence, plus the need for data to really be forward-looking. Again, thinking about it from a scenario analysis point of view, how are you embedding the social in that scenario analysis? And I think COP26 should create a great platform for accelerating that type of policy action. Secondly, ensuring that climate solutions that are coming out have effective social safeguards, which I think, again, we've all discussed and agreed on, and independent grievance mechanisms, as well as human rights due diligence in place to really, from policy to project level, like across the whole end, as set up by the UN Guiding Principles and also the OECD guidelines. And also, finally, asks for clearer frameworks with real accountability mechanisms. So including how governments are actually planning to engage with stakeholders, and that's where we've done some work also with signatories on and PRI as well in providing input on consultations in Canada on how do we, with regards to what does that just transition mean in practice? How does this really play out? And how, what are the type of mechanisms that are intended to be put in place? How can they enable greater meaningful action by investors as well? So I think there's that kind of tag game of investors can do so much and influence, but there also needs to be an environment for them to step up the game and kind of create more innovative and creative solutions. And then just on a final point, we're talking about deepening engagement and focusing more around this greening of jobs. And I think one thing that is just important to keep in mind from the social side is really that, this idea that green jobs are always great. I think green jobs need to be decent jobs. And I was actually just reading, I think this was a quote from Guy Ryder at the ILO, and he said, we will have green jobs by design, not by default. And I thought that was a really great way of actually bringing this into the conversation, of saying you need to really think about it in that way. And I think that's, the way investors are they need to shift their mentality and mindset a little bit on that to really think of it much more holistically. So I think, I don't know, I like to be hopeful. I like to be optimistic. I do think that COP26 will kind of be a test of whether countries and the private sector, including investors, are serious about really delivering the Paris Agreement. Because I think now we're coming to this point of we can't just do the talk. We need to actually really start moving, and there is space to be more creative in applying innovative solutions of using leverage where we can or where we can't, and being a little bit creative of how do we actually find a solution to some of this, because a lot of it we don't know yet. So we'll have to kind of anticipate as much as we can, but let's not at least repeat the mistakes we've learned from previous years again in this sense. So. Yeah,
we need to do something. Totally agree. So we're heading up to the end of our time, and I want to give everybody 30 seconds to give a charge to investors coming out of this. But we have a question from Pranay Krishnan, who's in India, asking about compliance and accountability. And John, what do you make of this question of accountability? And Bettina just brought it up. Mechanisms to ensure a just transition in place.
Well, you need accountability at every level of the system. So, the national courts ruling, like in the Netherlands against Shell, like these are, there's all the climate justice cases, for example. Government to government accountability, International Court of Justice isn't perhaps the most effective, but carbon chapters and bilateral trade agreements would really focus the mind, I think. So, you need accountability at all levels, under national law, international law, but also market-based accountability as well. So it's a big question, but climate justice is nothing without accountability.
Yeah, and those mechanisms aren't there in their global structures. Rachel, just as a brief charge, what is the thing we most need to focus on in this discussion to get somewhere?
Well, I think that notwithstanding the extraordinary sort of leadership from many in the financial sector, in different parts of the financial sector, that there's still a little bit of hand wringing about, well, if there was more predictability and if, governments would, lay a transition pathway, we could do more. The financial sector is extremely adept at making it perfectly clear to government what it needs when other things are at stake. And they're just not consistent in their voice about this. And this is not just the financial sector, but and so I think we're getting to that point where this needs to go a little bit deeper into the mainstream of the financial sector. So we're in a transition. We've come as far as we have. The next part is that we're going to need a little bit more consistency in the voice of the financial sector to regulators. And I think that I think that then things could actually move much quicker. And we will have to worry about the fact that different tectonic plates within the global sort of geopolitical environment are operating in slightly different biorhythms, as it were. But I do think that the financial sector is going to need to show up with a slightly more consistent voice if we're going to go beyond just the discussions of incrementally understanding the risk differently and moving towards perhaps a full embrace. Yeah,
I mean, I think that's a consistent and stronger voice, but also we can't work at the margins, and so the message has to be structural change within finance as well as within the economy. Gildas, 30-second charge.
Yes, I would go into the investors and financial institution world and say what we need is development of new skill sets. I mean by that to incorporate really the S component, the social component into our decision making, into our culture. I think financial institutions really need to change and factor that into their mindset. And to that point, I would say that investors that are naturally more connected to communities like public pension fund, place-based investors, workers' fund, or financial cooperatives like Desjardins are natural supporters of a just transition. So I think emulating the peers and the investors network to take communities and social components into greater consideration is key for me going into COP.
Yeah, I mean, different kinds of investors can play different roles, but certain kinds of investors are going to lead. Quickly, Bettina, and then to Alison, the last word goes to Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think in addition to my remarks, I think just that kind of mindset, right, of thinking for investors, also think about actually the outcomes. Like every investment has a negative or positive outcome. And I think it's kind of moving into that, and especially aligning this also with kind of the SDG agenda, really understanding where are we going with this? And again, I'm going to hamper on this, but like really understanding the environmental and the social agenda much more like integrated and kind of understand the implications, both negative and positive. And, bringing in also from whether you're an asset owner, the demands from your beneficiaries and really making sure that those come in, as Gildas was talking about, certain beneficiaries obviously are more kind of inclined to the social issues agenda, but really trying to mainstream this to see that actually it's not just about kind of financial risk, because a lot of these issues might not be financially material now, but they might be financially material in a year down the line, for example. So kind of
and that risk discussion works at the margins, right? And we can't work at the margins. I just feel like that's where investors need to make that change. Totally.
Exactly.
Alison?
I follow on from Bettina. It's moving from risk and risk assessment and risk taking to outcomes. As Rachel says, what is this excuse making that goes on about certainty? We're not certain. How's this going to deliver? Well, actually, it is about shifting both the action and making sure that's bold, and that the regulatory systems, central banks, take on not just their mandates around carbon emissions and transparency, but their mandates on full employment, that the Financial Stability Board seriously has a just transition plan and policy setting framework that actually embeds this in knowing that the financial system is also at risk if we don't actually ensure that these different elements come together, and that the social and employment consequences are really centered to it. So we say put workers at the center, but it's not just at the center, it's also at the table that these considerations.
Yeah, right. Making the decisions. Absolutely. Hamid, John, Sashwin, Rod, all you have great questions that we're not going to get to, but there's so much more to do anyway. Nick, I know that I've gone too long, but can you give us some, bring all this to a head and send us forth with what we need to do?
No, but I think maybe just sort of stitching together some of those final thoughts, I mean, and some of the questions which are really good. I mean, I think that the next move, particularly in the finance debate, is going to be moving to mandatory transition plans. Actually, we got mandatory reporting of transition plans coming in the UK. We got signals from the ECB that they're going to be requiring that, so as a regulatory step. And that is the moment where we're going to be incorporating just transition and social factors. So as John said, when TCFD was born, there were no people inside. I think as we move into these transition plans, both for corporates, but also for banks and investors, this is where we're going to make this much more integrated. And that's coming very soon. And I think it is part of this shift from a pure risk focus to an alignment and outcome focus. And as we know, workers' rights and human rights aren't a risk factor. They are a fundamental imperative. It's not a risk. So yes, I think that's going to be a particular focus. This focus on transition plans and then becoming very quickly mandatory, I think.
Terrific. Well, thanks everybody for being on. Thanks to all the speakers over the past 3 days, to our colleagues at GRI and my colleagues at IRI. I've really enjoyed talking with you, learning from you, and I leave thinking there is a ton to do in the just transition, and we need to do it.
Thanks all.